Asad Rehman, there were huge demonstrations yesterday. You have organized them. Talk about the mood inside the movements right now, and what are the chances to pressure the governments to do the right thing?
Well, yesterday there were millions of people who marched all around the world, over 150,000 people here in Glasgow, tens and tens of thousands around the country, in the UK and across all around Europe. And literally from every country, from Brazil to Uganda to Taiwan to South Korea. And people recognise, not just that we're in a climate crisis and that the urgency, we've all heard the code red for humanity and the need to tackle this crisis, but of course recognise that this crisis is tied up with other crises, from the COVID pandemic and the inequalities of vaccines to austerity and inequality. And there is a deep frustration and I think a real anger, and that's what brought people out on the streets. And particularly because here in these negotiations, we, the ordinary people, who are the eyes and the ears and voices of people, are locked out. We're not allowed in the negotiating rooms. We've been locked out of the venue. And so people are taken to the streets and are coming here to the People's Summit, not just to discuss what's wrong with the world, but to discuss what are our plans to solve this crisis, what are our strategies, how we're building collective power, how do we work both in our own countries and across borders with each other to move the dial from injustice to justice. So what we're seeing at the climate negotiations is really a lot of greenwash. So yes, our political leaders now, whether it's the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, UK President Joe Biden, have made tough-sounding speeches on climate. They say we recognise, we hear what the people are saying out there. But what's really interesting is, of course, is that they are not putting their plans or policies to deal with this crisis. They're not doing their fair share of action to keep temperatures below 1.5. They've yet to meet their promise of the 100 billion, which as we know, is a drop in the ocean to the scale of this crisis, refusing to accept liability for the damages, and really moving away from the kind of false hope and the false solutions of net zero and carbon markets. Instead, what we've seen is countless pronouncements actually outside of the UN process. They're being made with multinationals, the very same multinationals that caused this crisis, who are now saying, trust us, we will solve this crisis. But we have heard these promises before. Many of the statements that are being made are recycled statements from a decade ago, unmet then, and now we've been told, trust us again. These are not transparent, we can't hold them to account, there's no detail in them, they're just vague promises. What matters is hard negotiating facts, what's in the outcome of the climate negotiations. And if the UK government and if the US President are so committed to tackling the climate crisis, then they should be putting that into their NDCs, they should be putting that into their plans of action. Instead, both countries are about to sign off even more expansion of fossil fuels, more dirty oil, more dirty coal, more gas. They're turning their backs on the people of the global south. They're saying, we will raise 130 trillion to solve the climate crisis. Well, if you can't raise 100 billion, how do we trust you to raise 130 trillion? So put your money where your mouth is, then put the money on the table.
Voices of power, voices of the global south are often sidelined or suppressed when it comes to solutions to the crisis. Why are these voices so important?
Well, we're so important, the voices are so important because, our reality shape those policies. We know that solving the climate crisis without solving the crisis of inequality makes no sense, that often the very same solutions are required for both. We know that it's not possible to dig or burn your way out of this crisis by saying, well, we'll just keep growth infinite, we'll start a new wave of green colonialism and green extraction. That's the realities of people on the front line. So they are very different solutions. How do we transform our energy system, not simply from fossil fuels to renewable, but how do we make sure it tackles energy poverty? How do we keep it within the limits of the planet? How do we make sure that everybody has the right to live with dignity and living wages? These are the kind of plans and policies that our movements already have been discussing and been fighting for decades. We put these plans on the table decades ago and they've been ignored. Now, as we stand on the edge of catastrophe, people are realising that what we said is exactly what is needed. And those plans and policies are now becoming to be picked up by the young climate strikers, by new movements saying, we know what needs to be done and we are the ones that are going to do it.
You have already spoken about false solutions. What are the false solutions? What is so dangerous about them?
Well, you can cook the carbon books, right? But you can't fool the climate science. The climate science is very clear. We have a carbon budget to limit temperatures to well below 1.5. At best, at its most generous, we have less than 10 years to cut our emissions. And what matters is our accumulated emissions. What we emit now, not what we emit sometime in the future, because all of these raise our temperature level. What we've seen here under the net zero rubric is governments saying and corporations saying, let us continue to pollute. And sometime in the distant future, we'll invent technologies that will suck the carbon out of the atmosphere. Nobody knows what happens if you dial up the temperature and try and dial it down. What we do know is when you dial up the temperature, people's lives and livelihoods are lost, our ecosystems go out of whack, we've seen melt at the Arctic and the Antarctic, we've seen sea level rises. They are basically gambling with the very future of humanity and our planet with these risky technologies. So that's why it's so dangerous. It's simply a license to continue to pollute.
What is about the media? Are the media doing their fair share and report accurately about the crisis and about the course we are on? We are on a course 3+ temperature rise probably in the future.
Unfortunately, a lot of media are just I've taken sound bites from the UK government and reproduces them. I mean, we've had very, very critical conversations, for example, with the UK media, saying just because the British government sends you an email in the morning saying this is our press release, your job is not to simply reproduce it. As the media, your job is to interrogate it, to see does it live up to what it pronounces, to get the voices of climate scientists, of the academics to become on board. And instead what we're seeing is a very, very lazy journalism. Too much of the journalists, particularly in the global north, too willing to say our country are the climate champions. It's somebody else whose fault it is. It's not our fault. Well, without recognising the reality, of course, both of the climate science, but also the reality of climate injustice and our role as rich developed countries in creating that.
Movements demand the Green New Deal and climate justice. What does that mean and how should it be implemented in your view?
Look, a global Green New Deal is a radical interpretation, a radical framework. There are many different languages and words for it in many different areas. In Latin America, people are calling it the Eco-Social Pact. In Africa, the Eco-Feminist Pact. It's a justice transition. It's a recognition that we have to limit temperatures below 1.5, but that has to be done fairly. So that means rich countries decarbonize by 2030. It means we have to tackle global inequality and poverty. It means we have to live within the planetary limits. And that means no more unsustainable growth or extraction. But it also means recognising that the injustices that we face today are because of injustices that have been hardwired into our economic and political systems. That's from slavery to colonialism to imperialism to neoliberalism. That's that racism and patriarchy. These have been so embedded that they've created a sense that you can sacrifice both people and planet. You can sacrifice the poorest in the world. You can sacrifice black, brown, indigenous people and women. To turn that around, you need to do all of these four. And we can do it. It means not just saying fossil fuels to renewable energy. It says move from fossil fuels to energy being a public good, equitably distributed, fairly shared with everybody so we can tackle energy poverty. On food, it's not simply saying, oh, let's go organic, as if that's a solution. It's saying food should be a right for everybody, controlled by people, so we can cool the planet, but also feed the people. We know we can produce enough food to feed the world 3 times over, yet 2 billion people go hungry. Why? Because we have a broken food system. It means guaranteeing people living wages, social protection, access to universal services, the very things that the global north has used to protect itself during this pandemic. It also means fixing the global economy, tax the rich, fix our trading system which locks in the power of dirty energy corporations. It means reparations, repaying the debt that the global north has taken from the global south. Look, trillions have flown from the global south to allow the global north to be developed. We need an equitable distribution of both finance, but also lifting of technologies, so technologies can be shared. This is a moment for cooperation and solidarity, not a moment for competition and profit.
What gives you hope?
What gives me hope is people power. The people taken to the streets yesterday, the people took the streets day in, day out. What gives me hope is the movements on the ground resisting the power of multinational. What gives me hope is the incredible energy that we're seeing all around the world. Look at Chile, the cradle of neoliberalism, overthrown by a movement of movements approach. Look at the hundreds of millions of farmers taking to the streets in India against the BJP regime and the power of corporations. Everywhere, this flame is burning because everybody knows that this world and our economy is rigged against them. Our challenge now is to turn that anger, to turn that passion into solution and create the world that we want.
Thanks a lot, Asad Rehman, for the interview.